Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker. So quick question. Are you thinking about poker strategy the wrong way? In this Season 7 finale, we'll break down a concept that most players overlook, but heavily influences everything from Cbetting to bluff-catching. Formational awareness. If you've been categorizing spots simply as in position or out of position, you're missing the nuance that separates elite players from the rest. We'll get deep into how specific formations like button versus big blind or cutoff versus hijack radically change solver outputs, overbet frequencies, and exploitative decisions. Whether you're more focused on GTO or exploitative, this episode shows how granular awareness of formations leads to sharper, more profitable strategies. And if you like this conversation, be sure to get our new book, The Exploitative Edge, which is currently in pre-order when this episode immediately releases. I'll talk more about it at the very end of the episode, but this book will really bring this concept to life, along with many of the others we've looked at this season. Learn more and get your copy at redchippoker.com/edge, EDGE, and again, stick around to the end to hear more about it. But for now, here's Coach Weasel to break down formational awareness. Enjoy!
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. The title of this episode is Formational Awareness. The term formation in poker, it's been around for several years, and it's fairly similar to the term position in poker. The only difference is formation means something slightly more specific than position. When we think about the term position in poker, it's usually something that's binary, refers to either in position or out of position. Whereas formation refers to precise table positions. For example, could be button versus cutoff or button versus small blind. There is some middle ground here where we have something that's a bit more specific than general in position / out of position, but less specific than a precise formation. We have terms like early position formation. That's any formation where one of the players involved is in a position at the table earlier than the cutoff. We have late position formation. This means that all players are either cut off or later. Could be cutoff versus big blind, for example. And then something that's not common usage at this stage, I think there's room for the term mid-position formation. This would specifically be play involving the cutoff. Now, the reason why I mention this is that there's actually quite a big difference in terms of the way that the game plays, let's say button versus big blind compared to cutoff versus big blind. Whereas there's not so much of a difference between the way the game plays MP versus big blind compared to early position versus big blind. Cutoff is its own unique position at the table where players are open raising aggressively, but nowhere near as aggressively as the button, but still significantly more aggressively than the next position, the hijack. So there could be some room for the term mid-position formation. Either way, these are broad descriptors that refer to a few different specific formations, perhaps either all in late position or all in early position. Now, why is it important to have this term formation? Why can't we just continue to use the term position? And the reason is that the precise formation involved has a very significant impact on the correct strategy. And despite this, formation is not something that's commonly discussed as a variable in determining the best strategy. Usually something like position is. So we might say this is our Cbetting range in position, but this is our Cbetting strategy out of position. The exact scenario in terms of line is often taken into account as well as a variable. For example, players may discuss their Cbetting strategy in position in a single raised heads up pot. They may discuss their river pro betting strategy. They may discuss their delayed C-bet and follow-up bet, either in single raised pot or 3-bet pot. Now, these are all very useful ways of breaking the game down. It does make sense to talk about our delayed C-bet and follow-up strategy in a 3-bet pot, for example. But notice that none of those scenarios included a formation. At no point did we say our delayed C-bet and follow-up strategy button versus big blind or low jack versus hijack. We just completely ignored that when defining the scenario. And this is the way that many players approach the game. They have a C-bet strategy, in position, single raise, heads up pot. They don't necessarily break it down by formation. They don't have C-betting strategy button versus big blind or C-betting strategy UTG versus big blind. They simply have C-bet strategy in position, single raised, heads up pots. Now, it's not to say that this is a bad way of approaching the game, but it is overly broad because formation has a very large impact on the way that the situation is supposed to be played, despite the fact that many players completely ignore it when constructing their strategy. Now, we can demonstrate that with a few examples. As an example, let's think about Cbetting strategies in 3-bet pots. Now, we often hear players talk about things like Cbet frequency. What is your Cbet frequency in position in a 3-bet pot as the aggressor? What is your Cbet frequency out of position in a 3-bet pot as the aggressor? Again, we don't want to say that these aren't useful metrics, but they're just averages of how we're supposed to play across all of the available formations. Here are some data points extracted from a GTO solver. In a 3-bet pot, big blind versus small blind, this means small blind is open raised, we have 3-bet from the big blind. Our Cbet frequency is supposed to be 61.7%. Now, if you're currently Cbetting range in this scenario, this might sound like a fairly low Cbet frequency. And compared to other formations, it is. In fact, big blind versus small blind is arguably the lowest Cbet frequency in 3-bet pots. And yet players just lump it in with all of the other nodes where they're Cbetting in position in a 3-bet pot. If we take a different node, for example, button versus cutoff, so same situation, 3-bet pot in position, average Cbet frequency across all possible flops now skyrockets to 82.4%. So just to recap, big blind versus small blind Cbet in 3-bet pot, 61.7%, button versus cutoff Cbet in 3-bet pot, 82.4%. That's over 20% higher than the big blind versus small blind Cbet frequency. And yet players have one strategy. They just have Cbet in position in 3-bet pot strategy and don't differentiate based on formation. Now there's a clear pattern here when we have a look at hijack versus lowjack, aka MP versus UTG on a 6-handed table. The Cbet frequency in 3-bet pot across all possible flop textures jumps to 84%. The pattern here is that the earlier the formation, the higher the Cbet frequency. This is why in a late position formation, big blind versus small blind, we only have 61.7% Cbet frequency in 3-bet pots, whereas in the earliest possible formation, hijack versus lowjack, it's now correct to Cbet 84% of the time. This should absolutely have an impact on the way that we think about these scenarios. In the hijack versus lowjack 3-bet pot situation, there'll be many more hands that are pure strategies as a result of the very high average Cbet frequency in that scenario. A simple way of assimilating this piece of information is that if we're in an early position formation in a 3-bet pot and we have something that we believe is close, we should probably tend towards Cbetting. Whereas if we're in the big blind versus small blind 3-bet pot in position scenario, we should be more selective about the types of hands at Cbet. If we think a certain hand is close, we could tend towards checking back. We can extend similar logic to out of position play. Now, as a general rule of thumb, out of position is going to Cbet less aggressively in 3-bet pots compared to in position. However, as mentioned, big blind versus small blind Cbet frequency is the absolute lowest, despite being an in position node. If we take the latest possible out of position Cbet strategy in a 3-bet pot, that would be the big blind versus button formation, where we 3-bet big blind against a button open. GTO average Cbet frequency across every possible flop texture, big blind versus button, 63.4%. This is fairly similar to the big blind versus small blind Cbet frequency. It's a couple of percent higher, but this is still worthy of note because now we're out of position, so normally we Cbet less, but technically we should Cbet more aggressively big blind versus button than we do big blind versus small blind. And when we take a look at small blind versus button, something fairly interesting happens. We might imagine that big blind Cbet strategy in a 3-bet pot against a button caller is going to be fairly similar to small blind Cbet strategy in a 3-bet pot versus a button caller. After all, in both cases, it's a late position battle. It's a blind 3-bet against a button open. But what our viewpoint potentially fails to take into account is that big blind and small blind have quite different 3-bet strategies. Big blind has quite a number of speculative hands, whereas the small blind 3-betting strategy is much more depolarized and generally stronger. The end result is that small blind is supposed to Cbet quite a bit more aggressively than big blind as the aggressor in a 3-bet pot. Big blind versus button formation, Cbet frequency 63.4% as mentioned. Small blind versus button formation, 71.3% Cbet frequency, so noticeably higher. Now we're hopefully seeing the pattern. We're supposed to Cbet more aggressively in position. We're supposed to Cbet less aggressively in late position battles. And the small blind is supposed to Cbet more aggressively than the big blind. So with that information, we should be able to construct a scenario where we expect the c-bet frequency to be very high out of position. Also, for example, small blind versus low jack. This is now an early position formation. Now we call it early position despite the fact that small blind is late position. That's because one of the two players is in early position. So all it takes is for one player to be in early position. We then describe that as an early position formation. So small blind 3-bet against a low jack open. We can describe that as early position formation. We know the c-bet frequency is going to be fairly high because we're playing early position formation, 77.9% average c-bet frequency, small blind versus low jack. So this is not as aggressive as the in-position hijack versus low jack, which is 84%, but it's clear that we're supposed to c-bet quite a bit more frequently small blind versus low jack than small blind versus button. Now, while this doesn't tell us exactly what we're supposed to do in every situation, it does allow us to weight our play. We have a metagame idea in terms of which spots we're supposed to c-bet hyper aggressively and which scenarios we can look to be more reserved because the overall c-bet frequency is going to be low. Hopefully you're convinced that formational analysis is very important and has a big impact on strategy, and that it's actually a fairly weak approach to say things like, this is my c-bet strategy in position in 3-bet pots, without breaking it down further by formation. But just in case you're not convinced yet, let's think about a second situation where formation is very important in determining the correct strategy. Let's now think about a single raised pot situation, and we're going to talk about how often it's theoretically correct to overbet c-bet the flop. So this is something that is GTO correct. When we c-bet the flop in position in a single raised heads up pot, we are supposed to overbet some of the time. But the frequency with which we overbet is very much going to be influenced by the precise formation. So let's think about a very specific flop. Let's imagine the flop texture is ace-jack-4 rainbow. This is a type of double Broadway texture. The reason why we've selected this is because solver often likes to overbet on double Broadway textures as the aggressor, but not always. It depends on the formation. In fact, if we don't specify the formation, that's an example of a weak statement. Solver likes to overbet on an ace-jack-4 rainbow. That's true on average, but it's not necessarily true across every formation. So we're not being very precise with the way that we use language or the way that we think about poker unless we also specify a formation. Now, it turns out when we take a late position formation, button versus big blind, that of the c-betting strategy, solver overbets 30% of the time. Now, we're not thinking about the c-bet frequency itself here. We're purely thinking about how often should we overbet based on formation. Many players might not differentiate here. They may overbet the same range, depending on the board texture, and completely ignore formation. And I'm sure some players to this date never overbet the flop in the c-bet node. We might want to reconsider that after figuring out that the solver uses the overbet sizing 30% of the time, button versus big blind on the ace-jack-4 rainbow. Now, when we take a look at cutoff versus big blind, remember earlier in this podcast episode, we described that as mid-position formation. You'll probably get a feel for why I think this is its own unique formation by thinking about the overbet frequency, cutoff versus big blind. It drops to 18.6% overbet c-bet on the ace-jack-4 rainbow. That's quite a jump from 30%, from 30% to 18.6. Now, if we step back an additional position, let's imagine now we're in the hijack playing a single raised heads up pot in position against the big blind. Solver only overbets 1.9% of the time. So even with that change of a single position from the cutoff to the hijack, we basically hardly ever overbet as a result of that change in formation. So we can see the cutoff formation is the middle ground here, and as a result, it really represents its own unique formation at the poker table. In other words, we shouldn't even be playing cutoff in the same way that we play the button. If we were to lump both cutoff and button into the same category of late position formation, that's technically an imprecise way of thinking about the game. We should have button formation and we should have cutoff formation. We could use the term late position formation and mid position formation as discussed. Now, when we take an additional step backwards from the hijack to the low jack, the overbet frequency drops from 1.9% to 0.5%. Now, it's clear that there are strategic differences in the way that we're supposed to play hijack versus big blind compared to low jack versus big blind. But the change here is nowhere near as extreme as the changes we saw going from button to cutoff and from cutoff to hijack. So it probably is okay to group hijack and low jack into one formational bucket, the early position formation, because strategically, they're probably going to play close enough that we don't necessarily have to have a completely different approach to strategy across these two formations. Now, we might imagine button versus big blind is very similar to button versus small blind, although after our previous discussion on the way that small blind plays in 3-bet pots compared to big blind, we might not be so hasty to draw that conclusion. What we're learning here is that the small blind and big blind are unique positions at the table, and whether we occupy those positions or are playing against either of those positions, we can potentially anticipate some significant strategic differences. And this is reflected in the way that the solver plays here. Just as a recap, button versus big blind cold caller, solver is overbetting 30% of the time. Button versus small blind cold caller, solver is only overbetting 9.2% of the time. Very large difference in how often we're supposed to use the overbet sizing based on the precise position of the caller. The majority of players simply look at this as button versus blinds play. They don't change their strategy at all. But then when we think about the typical big blind cold calling range compared to the typical small blind cold call range, it actually seems kind of obvious that we should be playing a very different strategy depending on whether we're facing a small blind cold caller or a big blind cold caller. Now, we obviously overbet a lot less against small blind in general because small blind has a tighter range. We know if we go back to being the low jack opener against a small blind cold call, we would expect a very low frequency of overbets. And when we ask the solver how often it wants to overbet low jack versus small blind on the ace-jack 4 rainbow, we get the answer 0.8%. So overbetting is not something that's purely linked to the texture. It's linked to the texture and the formation. After all, it's the formation that's going to determine what types of ranges players show up with, which is ultimately one of the most important building blocks to figuring out the correct strategic approach. Now, everything we've talked about so far is heavily theoretical, but even in the world of exploitative poker, we find that formation is extremely important. Now, without going into specifics here, if you have the ability to run a range research report, aka population analysis in poker, one of the things you absolutely want to experiment with is breaking down stats by formation. It's very common that players will just look at a specific line without considering the precise positions involved. They will ask questions like, how often is the player pool bluffing when they pro-bet the river? And once again, we don't want to say that that's not useful. It is useful, especially if we find out that the player pool is over-bluffing when they pro-bet the river. But once again, that's an average value. It's much more useful to ask the question this way. Is the player pool over-bluffing with the river pro-bet line in a late position formation? Are they over-bluffing with the river pro-bet line in an early position formation or a mid-position formation? What we find as a very general guide is that the average opponent is quite a bit more likely to be bluffing or over bluffing in a late position formation. The way this usually works is very simply the more natural bluffs a player has. In other words, the more hands they have left in their range which really can't ever win at showdown, things like 6 high, 10 high, jack high, we can refer to these as natural bluffs. Hands that even players who don't like to bluff very much are probably thinking, man, I should really turn this holding into a bluff because my 6 high is never going to win here. The more natural bluffs a player has in their range, the higher their bluffing frequency on average. And we find that in late position battles, players have more natural bluff combos in their range, which translates into a higher overall bluffing frequency. If we instead take something like an early position formation, well, our opponent had a stronger range going into the hand to begin with. That translates to less natural bluff combos by the river, which then translates into a lower overall bluffing frequency. So there are some situations where it could be correct to bluff catch in a late position formation, but it's actually minus EV to bluff catch in an early position formation. Either way, we need to base our analysis around formation, not just the line that's taking place. The same can be said if we're thinking about bluffing. Our opponent is more likely to be folding in a late position formation. Once again, there's more air in our opponent's range, which translates into a higher folding frequency. Whereas if it's an early position formation, our opponent is going to have a slightly stronger distribution of hands above a certain strength. They're going to have more bluff catches, they're going to have more strong made hands. That's going to translate into a lower folding frequency. There are situations where it's correct to bluff in a late position formation, but it's incorrect to bluff with the same line, assuming we're now in an early position formation. So let's think about some key takeaways here. The first and major key takeaway here is that our strategy should change according to formation. If you've gone through your entire poker career just thinking about the line or just thinking about your position, but not the formation, you are not getting the best of it. Strategy changes heavily based on formation. We've seen two broad categories of examples where formation is important. The first is on a more theoretical level. So this usually applies to earlier street play where we don't necessarily know what the max exploit is, so we can use theory to guide our decisions. We've seen very simply that in 3-bet pots, for example, there are some spots where we should be c-betting quite a bit more aggressively as a function of the formation, and there are other formations where we should be c-betting with a more reserved approach, so we have a much lower c-bet frequency overall. And we can use that to inform our decisions, especially when playing close spots, can help tip us towards either a check or a c-bet. The second broad category here is more from the exploitative perspective, which is figuring out when it's going to be plus EV to either bluff or bluff catch, or even bluff raise in some cases. There are a number of situations where in a late position formation, it's plus EV to bluff raise the river, depending on the line. Whereas if you take that same line, but it's now an earlier position formation, it's now minus EV to bluff raise the river. And let's just say, for example, we didn't factor formation into our population analysis at all, we'd probably see a break-even bluff raise or slightly losing. In other words, because we don't look at formation, we completely miss the profitable bluff raise opportunities in a late position formation. So this ends up being quite a big blind spot because when running pool analysis, all we're doing is getting an average of every formation, whereas what we're interested in, specific data points based around the precise formation. All right, hopefully this has given you something to think about. It should give a boost to the way you think about the game. You should be able to construct more precise strategies. Thanks very much for listening to the content. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Like I mentioned in the intro, our new book, The Exploitative Edge, is the perfect way to continue diving into concepts like this. In a world dominated with GTO and solver discussion, one fact gets overlooked too often. Humans make mistakes. Humans don't take the perfect GTO line. They don't mix at the perfect frequency, and they tend to follow herd strategies, for better or worse. So building off the work of our popular GTO Gem series, the Exploitative Edge re-aims at the exploit side of strategy, showing you to profile correctly, target weaknesses, minimize your own leaks, and turn solver limitations into winning opportunities. If that sounds up your alley, get your copy of the Exploitative Edge today by visiting redchippoker.com/edge. That's EDGE. You can also search for it on Amazon if you prefer paperback. Links for both are in the description box. And that's going to be a wrap, not just for this episode, but this season as well. Make sure to subscribe so you know exactly when Season 8 fires up. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.